William Wallace, 1305. When we talk about medieval courage and cruelty, few names hit harder than William Wallace. Born around 1270 near Paisley, Scotland, he was a minor noble who became the symbol of resistance after England tried to crush Scottish freedom. In 1297, he led a rising that stunned the English army at the Battle of Stirling Bridge, where a smaller Scottish force destroyed about 5,000 English troops through clever use of terrain and timing. For a moment, he was Scotland's guardian, the man on every rebel's lips. But power shifted fast in that century. After defeat at Falkirk in 1298 and years on the run, Wallace was betrayed near Glasgow and handed to King Edward I. His interrogation wasn't about justice, it was theater. Tried in London for treason, a charge twisted by the fact he'd never sworn loyalty to England, Wallace refused to beg. On August 23, 1305, he was dragged through the city, hanged, disemboweled, beheaded, and quartered. His remains were displayed across Britain as a warning. Instead, it backfired. His death ignited generations of defiance, inspiring Robert the Bruce's ultimate victory at Bannockburn in 1314. Even 700 years later, Wallace stands not as a victim, but the enduring face of a nation that refused to kneel.
Joan of Arc, 1431. Few stories from the Middle Ages burn as fiercely as Joan of Arc's. Born in 1412 in the small French village of Domremy, she grew up during the Hundred Years' War, an endless struggle between France and England that had left her country broken and leaderless. At just 17, Joan claimed she was guided by divine voices urging her to drive out the English. In 1429, she convinced Prince Charles, the future Charles VII, to let her lead an army to Orleans. Against every expectation, she broke the English siege in 9 days. That single victory revived a nation's will to fight and turned a farm girl into a living legend. But glory in that world lasted only as long as politics allowed. Captured the next year by Burgundian allies of England, Joan was sold to her enemies and put on trial for heresy and cross-dressing. The court's outcome was predetermined. On May 30th, 1431, at the age of just 19, she was led into Rouen market square and burned alive before a crowd of thousands. 25 years later, the church reversed its verdict and declared her innocent. By 1920, she was canonized as a saint. In life, she was condemned as a witch. In death, she became France's eternal symbol of faith, courage, and national identity, proof that conviction can outlast fire itself.
Edward II of England, 1327. Edward II's life reads like a royal cautionary tale, born to rule, undone by love and pride. Crowned in 1307, he was the son of the formidable Edward I, but he lacked his father's iron grip. His closeness to court favorites, especially Piers Gaveston, angered the English barons who saw the relationship as proof of weakness and corruption. After years of revolt, military failure in Scotland, and humiliation at Bannockburn in 1314, power slipped away. His French queen, Isabella, allied with her lover, Roger Mortimer, and invaded England in 1326. The king fled, was caught, and forced to abdicate in favor of his teenage son, Edward III. Imprisoned at Berkeley Castle, Edward endured misery beyond the throne's reach. Chroniclers differ on what came next. Some say he was secretly murdered to prevent rescue. Others describe an infamous act of torture to ensure his death left no visible wound. What's certain is that by September 1327, the former king was dead at 43. Within 3 years, Isabella and Mortimer were overthrown by the young Edward III, who avenged his father, restoring royal authority. Edward II's grim end became legend, a warning to every monarch that indulgence, favoritism, and betrayal could reduce a king to a prisoner in his own realm.
Simon Sudbury, 1381. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 was England's volcanic outburst against unfair taxes and corrupt power, and Archbishop Simon Sudbury stood right at ground zero. Born around 1316, Sudbury rose from scholar to Archbishop of Canterbury and Lord Chancellor under Richard II. To fund the king's wars, he supported the hated poll tax, levied on every adult regardless of income. It was the spark the countryside needed. On June 14, 1381, thousands of rebels led by Wat Tyler stormed into London. They broke through the Tower of London's gates, unthinkable at the time, and found Sudbury hiding in the chapel. Dragged outside, he tried to speak, praying aloud for mercy, but the mob had none. It took several swings to sever his head. Eyewitnesses said his lips were still moving in prayer after the final blow. His decapitated head was carried on a pike through the streets before being displayed on London Bridge. Even in death, he became a symbol of divine punishment to some, of reckless revenge to others. Centuries later, his skull was discovered in Canterbury Cathedral, still separate from his body, a haunting relic of the day England's fury quite literally took the head of its church.
Richard of York, 1660. If ambition had a face in medieval England, it was Richard Plantagenet, Duke of York. Born 1411, he was cousin to King Henry VI and possessed both royal blood and restless pride. When Henry's weakness plunged England into chaos, Richard saw himself as the man destined to save the realm, whether by guidance or by crown. The struggle became what we now call the Wars of the Roses, a feud between the White Rose of York and the Red Rose of Lancaster. In 1460, Richard marched south with a huge army, convinced rebellion would force recognition of his claim. But at Wakefield, near Christmas, the trap closed. Lancaster's forces ambushed the Yorkists. The Duke, outnumbered and surrounded, fought to the end but was cut down on the field. The victors showed no mercy. His head was severed, set high on Micklegate Bar in York, and mockingly crowned with a paper diadem so the whole city could gape at a dead man's broken royal dream. Yet the story didn't end in humiliation. Within months, his son Edward avenged him, seized the throne, and became King Edward IV. So even though Richard's death was brutal, it lit the fuse that built the Yorkist dynasty, proof that in medieval politics, blood and legacy were never far apart.
Jacques de Molay, 1314. The death of Jacques de Molay signaled the twilight of the medieval knightly orders and the brutal reach of royal power. Born around 1240 in Burgundy, he joined the Knights Templar, a crusading order once celebrated as defenders of the Holy Land and holders of immense wealth. Rising through the ranks, de Molay became the order's Grand Master in 1292, just as the Crusader states collapsed. Back in France, he faced a dangerous ally, King Philip IV, known as Philip the Fair, not for kindness, but for cold ambition. The crown owed the Templars massive sums of money. So, in 1307, on a single October morning, Philip ordered every Templar in France arrested. Under torture, fabricated confessions of heresy and blasphemy followed. Even Pope Clement V gave in, dissolving the order. For 7 years, de Molay remained imprisoned, denying guilt and demanding open trial before Christendom. On March 18, 1314, aged in his 70s, he was led to a scaffold on an island in the Seine. Refusing to retract his faith, he was burned alive alongside another Templar leader. Witnesses said he called on God to judge the guilty, Philip and Clement, who both died within the year. That eerie coincidence made de Molay a legend, the last Templar consumed by fire, yet forever seen as the man who cursed kings and buried a dynasty's honor.
Thomas Becket, 1170. Among all medieval martyrs, Thomas Becket stands out as the moment politics and faith collided inside a church. Born 1119, the son of a London merchant, he rose swiftly, educated, charming, and fiercely capable. King Henry II noticed and made him royal chancellor, a post that bound the two men in friendship and ambition. But in 1162, Henry elevated him to Archbishop of Canterbury, expecting loyalty first to the crown. Instead, Becket transformed into a defender of church rights, refusing to let royal courts try clerics. For Henry, that felt like betrayal. Tension built for years. Exile, negotiation, and stubborn pride on both sides. Finally, during one bitter argument, the king supposedly cried out, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" 4 knights took him literally. On December 29, 1170, they rode to Canterbury Cathedral and confronted Becket during evening prayers. He refused to flee. In moments, swords flashed, striking him down before the altar. Chroniclers wrote that blood and brains splattered the stone steps, a shocking violation in a holy place. The murder horrified Europe. Pilgrims flocked to his tomb, miracles were reported, and just 3 years later, he was canonized as a saint. Even Henry II publicly performed penance. Becket's death turned power into guilt, and forever reminded rulers that a churchman's conscience could defy a king's command.
Gilles de Rais, 1440. If medieval chivalry had a nightmare side, it was Gilles de Rais, a warrior noble who fell from saintly heroism to monstrous infamy. Born 1405 in Brittany, he was one of France's richest lords and fought alongside Joan of Arc, even helping reclaim Orléans. Courageous, educated, and lavishly wealthy, he seemed the image of virtue. But when peace returned, something inside him broke. He squandered his fortune on plays, alchemy, and bizarre experiments in search of power. Rumors grew that children were disappearing near his castles. By 1440, investigations by both church and state exposed horror beyond belief. The mutilation and killing of dozens, possibly hundreds, of peasant boys and servants. Crimes so shocking that the judges struggled to record them. At trial in Nantes, de Rais confessed amid tears and prayers. He begged for absolution, then faced his sentence calmly. On October 26, 1440, he was hanged and burned, his ashes scattered. To many, he became a ghost story, the fallen knight who sold his soul after serving a saint. Some modern historians debate whether part of the case was exaggerated by politics, yet his name endures as the grim archetype of corruption, the proof that even glory forged beside Joan of Arc could decay into absolute darkness.
Peter of Castelnau, 1208. Sometimes one man's death can ignite a war. Peter of Castelnau, a Cistercian monk and papal legate, became that match. Born in southern France, he worked for Pope Innocent III, whose great mission was to stamp out a growing faith he saw as heresy, the Cathar movement spreading through Languedoc. The Cathars rejected the church's power and wealth, preaching purity and dualism. To the papacy, that was spiritual rebellion. To locals, a bid for independence. Peter was sent to persuade rather than punish, but his zeal was merciless. He excommunicated the powerful Count Raymond VI of Toulouse for failing to act against the heretics. Then, on January 15, 1208, not far from St. Gilles, Peter was ambushed and fatally stabbed by one of Raymond's followers. The Pope's reaction was swift and furious. He proclaimed a crusade, not against Muslims, but against fellow Christians. The Albigensian Crusade that followed lasted 20 years and devastated southern France, killing tens of thousands. Peter's murder was brief. Its echo reshaped Europe. It hardened papal authority, crushed the culture of Occitania, and set a precedent for holy war within Christendom itself. One blade on a river road began one of the darkest chapters in medieval religious history.
King Conrad of Montferrat, in a chaos of the Third Crusade, ambition and betrayal often traded places, and King Conrad of Montferrat paid for that dance with his life. Born into a noble Italian family, Conrad was brave, political, and calculating. When he arrived in the Holy Land in 1187, Jerusalem had just fallen to Saladin. Conrad helped defend Tyre, turning it into the last major Christian stronghold. His success made him a hero and a rival to Guy de Lusignan, another claimant to the throne of Jerusalem. Tension over who should rule split the Crusaders into bitter camps. Even Richard the Lionheart and Philip II of France took opposing sides. Eventually, the local nobles elected King Conrad of Jerusalem in 1192, but before he could claim the crown, fate or politics intervened. Only days after the election, on April 28, 1192, as Conrad walked home through the streets of Tyre, two men approached and stabbed him to death. They were members of the feared Nizari assassins, whose hidden fortress served as both legend and terror. No one ever proved who ordered the hit, Richard the Lionheart, his rival Guy, or Saladin himself. Conrad's death ended one man's dream, but fed centuries of suspicion and myth, proof that in Crusader politics, daggers often spoke louder than crowns.
Harald Hardrada, 1066. The last great Viking king died chasing one final dream of conquest. Harald Hardrada, born 1015 in Norway, had lived the kind of life sagas envy: exile, warfare, ransom, and glory. As a young mercenary in the Byzantine Varangian Guard, he fought from the Mediterranean to the Holy Land, returning home with gold and a legend. By 1046, he claimed Norway's throne, ruling for 20 years with iron discipline. But ambition burned hotter than prudence. He believed he deserved England's crown, just as his ancestor had ruled it before. In 1066, he sailed west with about 10,000 men, a fleet so large English witnesses said it darkened the sea. At first, fortune smiled. He crushed local forces at Fulford near York, but 3 days later, on September 25, King Harold Godwinson struck back at Stamford Bridge. Caught off guard in the autumn heat, many Norse had left their armor on the ships. Despite fighting bare-chested and almost mythic in courage, Harold took an arrow through the throat and died where he stood. The survivors limped home in fewer than 30 ships out of the 300 that had left Norway. Within weeks, Harold Godwinson himself would fall to William the Conqueror at Hastings. So 1066 became the year 3 kings died for one crown, and with Hardrada's fall, the Viking Age breathed its last.
Vlad the Impaler, 1476. Few rulers have blurred legend and terror like Vlad III Dracula, Prince of Wallachia, known to history as Vlad the Impaler. Born 1431 in Transylvania, he was a hostage of the Ottoman Empire in his youth, learning both politics and cruelty in equal measure. When he claimed the throne of Wallachia in 1456, his tiny principality lay trapped between Hungary and the Ottomans, a killer-be-killed frontier. To keep control, Vlad ruled through fear. His signature punishment, impalement, was agonizingly slow and public, meant to terrify enemies into obedience. Contemporary accounts speak of tens of thousands impaled on stakes outside cities or along roads. The victims included nobles, rebels, and foreign invaders. For his people, that horror sometimes worked. He restored order and frightened away conquerors. But brutality breeds vengeance. In 1476, during renewed war with the Ottomans, Vlad was ambushed. perhaps betrayed by his own boyars. He was killed in battle near Bucharest. His head, taken as proof, was sent to Sultan Mehmed II and displayed on the stake in Constantinople. Over centuries, his legacy warped into myth. Part national hero, part monster, the grim seed later feeding Bram Stoker's imagination. In truth, Vlad's death closed an age where survival demanded savagery and left history with one of its darkest anti-heroes.
Margaret Pole, 1541. The execution of Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, was one of the Tudor age's most chilling scenes. Born 1473, the last surviving link to England's Plantagenet dynasty, she was niece to Kings Edward IV and Richard III. Henry VIII restored her titles, and under his son Henry VIII, she became governess to the young Princess Mary. For decades, Margaret lived as a loyal noblewoman, respected for faith and intellect. Then came the Reformation. When Henry broke from Rome, her Catholic loyalty and family name became dangerous. Her son, Reginald Pole, a cardinal, openly condemned the king's marriage and religious changes. Enraged, Henry branded the entire family traitors. In 1539, Margaret, now nearly 70, was imprisoned in the Tower of London. No real evidence tied her to rebellion, yet in May 1541, the crown ordered her death. On the scaffold, she refused to kneel, declaring, "So should traitors do, and I am none." The inexperienced executioner struck 11 times before severing her head. Witnesses called it one of the most barbaric killings ever seen at the Tower. Margaret Pole's fate terrified England's nobility, proof that even royal blood offered no safety. Beatified centuries later, she stands as a tragic figure of conscience, crushed by royal paranoia and the ruthless new order of Henry VIII.
Prince Edmund of Woodstock, 1330. The fall of Prince Edmund of Woodstock, Earl of Kent, shows how even royal blood couldn't protect a man from medieval politics. Born 1301, the youngest son of Edward I and half-brother to Edward II, Edmund grew up loyal to the crown, but when his brother was deposed in 1327 by Queen Isabella and her lover Roger Mortimer, that loyalty became a death sentence. Believing rumors that Edward II was still alive in prison, Edmund plotted to free him, an act that Mortimer called treason. It was almost pitiable. Some reports suggest Edmund truly thought he was saving his brother, not rebelling. Yet once discovered, the sentence was inevitable. On March 19, 1330, the 40 senators of the realm signed his death warrant. When the time came, his appointed executor fled, terrified to strike a prince. After delays, a lowly kitchen servant was offered money to take the job. With rough swings of the axe, the king's own uncle was beheaded outside Winchester Castle before a small, horrified crowd. Only months later, young Edward III overthrew Mortimer and Isabella, avenging his uncle's needless death. Edmund of Woodstock's execution became both a moral warning and a family tragedy, proof that loyalty, in turbulent England, could be every bit as fatal as treason.
Andronikos IV Palaiologos, 1385. In the fading light of the Byzantine Empire, few stories capture a royal cruelty like that of Andronikos IV Palaiologos, a prince undone by ambition and his own family. Born 1348, the eldest son of Emperor John V Palaiologos, he grew up as Constantinople's heir during a time of bankrupt coffers and encroaching enemies. But when his father leaned too heavily on the Ottoman Turks for support, Andronikos saw weakness and plotted rebellion. In 1373, he joined the Turkish Sultan's son in a joint uprising against their fathers. Both failed. The punishment was deliberate humiliation. Andronikos was blinded and imprisoned, a Byzantine tradition meant to ensure he could never legitimately rule. But fate handed him another chance. Escaping with Genoese help, he regained partial sight, returned with foreign backing, and seized Constantinople in 1376, proclaiming himself emperor. For 3 uneasy years, he ruled alongside his teenage son, John VII Palaiologos, plundering the city's treasures to reward mercenaries. Eventually, his father regrouped, retook the throne, and this time finished the family feud. In 1385, amid renewed conspiracies, Andronikos was captured and killed. The method went unrecorded, but after a lifetime of rebellion, betrayal, and blinding, his end was merciless. His story is the Byzantine Empire in miniature, brilliance decaying into civil war, where thrones passed from father to son through the shadow of blood.